Everybody, thanks for coming out. It's a fun topic tonight. I imagine that everybody that's here has already delved into this topic a little bit themselves to whatever extent. Inevitably, whether you're just a hobbyist gardener at home or you're involved with plants in any more professional capacity, there's a lot of terminology out there to learn. It can be really daunting, but in the long run, it's very helpful. And so we're gonna go over a lot of terminology tonight. I don't want anyone to feel too overwhelmed. I try to think of it in the same way as learning all these words to talk about the anatomy and physiology of plants. It's really no different than learning all the terms for our own anatomy and physiology. You can get as basic or as complex about it as you want to for your needs, but inevitably the more that you know, the more that information can help you in the long run, and the more that, particularly as we'll talk tonight, the easier that it will be to identify different plants, because you'll not only understand the words for things, but knowing the words will help you recognize specific or unique aspects of different plants that maybe you didn't pick out before when you're just looking at, yeah, it's a green thing and it has leaves and it's got some stems. But we can look much closer at that, and we can appreciate the details that make different plants, or as we'll get into tonight, different families of plants unique. And that's what we're going to focus on. I'm going to be jumping between just me talking or using a whiteboard, and I've got some PDFs that I made that I'll be sharing. So we'll jump all around and we'll have a good time. We're going to start with some context, a little bit about as science understands it, the evolution of plants, so that we can appreciate some of the significant differences that we see in plants on the world today. So as far as, and I am of course generalizing all of this information a lot. There's plenty out there if you want to get more in depth. And even for now, as Alex said, if you have any questions, just ask them in the chat and we'll address them as they come up. But so in general, our understanding of the evolution of plants is that, as with most forms of life, structurally, they started much more simply long ago in the early days of life on our planet. The first cells that we designate as plant cells were the ones that became photosynthetic, the ones that for various reasons were able to figure out a way to convert that precious sunlight into energy. And that is where the plant branch on the tree of life really breaks off for most people. And again, structurally, they start very simple. We're talking about bunches of photosynthetic cells. Usually they are very dependent on water, so they either need to be in a totally aquatic situation, or if they were land plants, they needed to be saturated or wet on a very regular basis. This wasn't just so that their cells wouldn't dry out and they would die. They didn't have, this is before any kind of root system to actively pull water out of the ground. So basically, if there wasn't any water around, then you're out of luck. But also, importantly, water and later on wind were the primary ways that these plants would procreate. They would produce spores and other structures that kind of existed before the complex seeds that we think of, and they would basically just set them adrift in whatever water that they existed in, or they would let it go off on the breeze and just bank that spore or whatever is either going to reach a new location where it can start to grow on its own, or as we got into sexual selection and we actually had plants that needed to breed with each other in order to procreate, you would release your spores into whatever water you were in, and you were just banking on the fact that they would find the right mate who was floating somewhere else in the water. So if I can get this visual to work for you, we can imagine our plants. Again, we're starting as usually, oh, of course that won't work for me. Let's try a different one. Usually we're imagining starting with just groups of cells in some way. It would have started as smaller groups of cells through evolution, advancement, They would have gotten more cells, more structurally complex. Again, I was trying to draw them in green to emphasize they're all photosynthetic. They're all using light to produce energy. But more importantly, they need water. They cannot dry out. If they dry out, no good. They won't last long. And these types of plants, to some extent, still exist today. These are things like mosses and liverworts, which, you know, they're basically just green carpets of photosynthetic cells. They have a little more structure to them, but basically the big mass of photosynthesis going on. And again, it needs to stay wet. If it dries out, it either has to go completely dormant and hope for a better time when there's more moisture that it can use, or it's going to die eventually. Now, jumping forward in evolution, this was a great new strategy. These early plants clearly were pretty successful. Some of them, again, like mosses, so successful that we still see them today. But they could only be so successful. They had really strong limitations. And the biggest one being that they didn't have a way to exist outside of a aquatic or a very saturated environment. So what did they do? Well, it turns out that the successful strategy became to produce special tissues that were basically like pipes. And those pipes could funnel water and nutrients through the cell. And there would even eventually become channels where certain pipes would run one way, certain pipes would run the other way. Plants that evolved this way to get these very specialized tissues to move material throughout their body actively, not passively, not just letting water move where it wants to. These are known as vascular plants. And vascular tissues are specialized tissues that, again, are moving material. The most common that we hear about today, and the vast majority of plants today, are either there are specialized tissues known as xylem, Z-Y-L-E-M, that are moving water. Predominantly, they're moving water up from the root system into the plant and all of the cells within the plant that need it. And then there's phloem. Phloem is a specialized tissue that predominantly is taking sugars and other materials produced in the tissue of the plant, predominantly in the leaves, and it's moving those nutrients and that energy to different parts of the plant that need it, predominantly back down into the roots. And so with the evolution of vascular plants, plants have this mechanism by which they can much more consciously, actively move material. They can decide, I need more water. I'm going to go pull more water out of the ground. Or I need more of this or that nutrient. I'm going to try and pull more of that out of the ground. Or maybe, oh, there's, you know, this leaf over here, this root isn't doing so hot. It needs some more nutrition. So I'm going to take some of those sugars from this leaf up here I produced and move it down my phloem cells to the necessary area where it will benefit me. So vascular tissue was a huge advancement in plants on Earth. And the vast majority of plants that we see today are classified as vascular. Pretty much anything that you would recognize as a plant, anything that has stems and leaves of any kind is a vascular plant. But even when we had the advancement of vascular plants, there still wasn't a significant difference in procreation methods. Specifically, seeds did not exist yet. So just like the mosses and the liverworts, these much more simple structures, early vascular plants were not producing seeds. They were still producing spores, and therefore they still relied on the movement of those spores through a water column or through wind action. Much more of a gamble in terms of being able to successfully procreate, but definitely better than the mosses. You have much more of a chance of getting your spores to where they need to get to. And again, there are plenty of examples of these types of early vascular plants that don't produce seeds that still exist today. Things like ferns and horsetails. Things that we tend to think of as very old plants that were around in prehistoric times. Well, they're successful enough that they still exist today. However, with the advancement or the evolutionary progression into the production of seeds, we have even greater chances of reproductive success. And so the vast majority of plants that we see today produce seeds. Now, what do we think of when we think of a seed? You know, of course, there's the basic image of this nice, cute, tiny little thing that'll eventually grow into a mature plant someday. And so it is the point at which the initial procreation takes place, especially if we're talking about plants that are using sexual selection. This is where we have the male and female parts coming together, forming that initial new organism. But the majority of a seed, and I don't care if we're talking about something massive like a coconut or some tiny little mustard seed that's like a grain of sand that you can fit in your hand. The majority of the actual physical space of that seed is nutrients. It's nutrients, it's minerals, it's lots of carbs, sugar, it's energy that is going to help that new organism get started when it begins to grow, which we know of as germination, when the seed first breaks its coat and a root and usually a single shoot that's going to go up begins to form. So if most of the time it's easier with some types of plants than others, but you can slice into that seed and you can differentiate different tissues. There's usually a very small little area that you can tell, okay, that is actually the beginning of the plant. That's where all of these specialized tissues, the roots and the vascular tissues that are going to grow into stems, that's where it's all going to originate from. And then around that tiny little speck within the seed, there will be this large area that's just nutrient storage. The idea behind this is the more nutrients that the seed can pack in, the better chance that it will have when it germinates of surviving. The seed and the parent that is dropping that seed, that plant has no idea what is going to happen to that seed once it drops it, where it's going to end up, the conditions that are going to be in that area. Is it going to be ideal for the seed? You know, there are going to be a lot of stress factors that make it really challenging for that seed to get a hold, to grow some decent roots, to get some decent photosynthetic tissue above the ground and really make a spot for itself in the world. So the best thing that it can do is have as much energy and nutrients up front, so that when your plants first germinate, anytime that you put a seed in the ground and it's first germinating, for at least those first couple of days, if not longer, when it's coming out of the ground and it's beginning to grow those first little leaves, they are green and it is starting to photosynthesize and produce some new energy that way. However, the majority of the energy that a brand new seedling, a brand new plant is using is energy that was already stored up within the seed. And so it's taking advantage of that to establish itself before it even has to bother with what's in the environment around me. Aside from this huge perk of, you know, helping the seed along, helping the new offspring organism increase its likelihood of surviving because it has all this energy to start out with in the first place, seeds also, as an evolutionary strategy, introduced the potential of durability that would allow these seeds to last for, in some cases, years and years before they even have to think about trying to germinate and make it in the world. Some common examples throughout the world would be something like an oak tree that produces a ton of acorns. Well, not only is the actual coating of that acorn pretty hard, you know, because not that most people are trying, but you can't just easily bite into and chew up an acorn. It's very hard, and it takes a lot of time in the wild for that material to break down and decompose. So that's a thick protected layer for that seed. And then also in the case of acorns, oak trees produce a lot of tannins, very acidic chemicals that help to prevent things like bacteria and fungi from breaking down and consuming that seed before it has a chance to try and germinate. And so through the production of seeds, there are all these different examples where the plant offspring now is incredibly durable and is able to survive a lot of different hardships and is that much more likely to actually survive, germinate, and grow up and hopefully procreate themselves. So it's a huge advancement. And again, as we continue, it's the theme of the vast majority of plants that you're going to encounter in your life are going to be vascular plants that produce seeds. It's a very successful strategy, and so we see a lot of examples of it in the world. Now, so we have the advancement of seeds, very durable, strong structures. But initially, that was all. There wasn't anything covering the seed, as in there wasn't any fruit. We had plants that were producing bare seeds that they would just drop into the environment as is. And again, we still have examples of this today. They're known as the gymnosperms, the cone-bearing plants, things like pines and all other kinds of evergreens. You'll notice that they don't have a flower in any sense that we commonly think of a flower. They do have specialized structures that will produce spores or pollen so that they can procreate, that one tree can pollinate another tree, or a tree can pollinate itself. However, when they are ready and that pollination has successfully taken place, what you'll get is a cone. And that cone, under every single little scale on that pine cone, for example, there will be a single seed. And again, there's no special soft, sweet flesh of any kind. It's just a bare kernel of a seed. And when that tree is ready, that pine cone will open up, and we'll see, as we commonly see pine cones once they've already fallen to the ground, all of the scales have flared open. And as they open, they loosen the seeds underneath and allow them to drop out. And they'll just drop wherever, and hopefully they'll germinate, or hopefully some animal will come along and bury them somewhere and forget about them. But so we have gymnosperms. We have seed-producing plants, but they produce a naked seed, as you may commonly see it read. And then last but not least, we have flowering plants. These are plants that produce a flower to attract organisms for pollination, and then the seeds that they produce are encased in some kind of fruit. And you know, we can all appreciate the value of fruit. There's not only in different situations does it make the seed that much more durable, because the fruit actually has to break down and decompose before there's even any direct stress on the seed itself. But usually that fruit is very desirable or palatable to different kinds of organisms, encouraging those organisms to transport those seeds, to move them from the location of the parent plant to a totally new place in one form or another. The most common example being you eat it. If you're an animal and you eat the fruit of a plant and that fruit has seeds in it, those seeds are going to pass through you in the vast majority of cases, especially in a plant that has evolved the strategy to try and get animals to consume its fruit. The seeds contained in there are so durable that they can handle all of the digestion and the heavy acids and other chemical reactions that are going on in your body or the animal, whatever body consumed it, such that when that animal excretes waste at some point in the future, all of the seeds will still be present and they won't be damaged. In fact, they'll be that much more primed now to try and germinate and take off and make a life for themselves in whatever new location they were just dropped in. So we have flowering plants, which the fancy term that we use is Angiosperms. I'm going to pull up a visual here to basically just explaining what I just went over. There it is. All right, so here's some of the terminology. This visual is, of course, very simplified, but it gives you a basic idea of not just the diversity of plants that are out there, but we can appreciate from an evolutionary perspective how kind of one thing led to another. We can see the plants with simpler structures and designs that came much earlier in the history of the earth, and we can see how different adaptations and evolutionary changes have advanced and changed plants to the majority of what we see today. And again, as we progressed, it's just with each of these new successive strategies of vascular tissues and then seeds and then some kind of flower to attract pollinators, and some kind of fruit to protect those seeds or attract organisms to the seeds to move them, we get higher and higher rates of success in procreation and propagating the new generation. And so we tend to see more and more variety of these different types of plants with these new strategies, such that in today's world, the angiosperms, flowering plants that produce flowers and fruit, are the most prevalent plants in the world. The majority of plants that you will ever encounter are angiosperms of one kind or another. And I noted here in this slide the difference between monocots and dicots. It's an important terminology. Just you'll hear it come up a lot in different books and sources. When a seed first germinates and it first has a little shoot coming out of the ground, it has the first little leaves that come out. Those leaves are very specialized. They usually don't look like what the actual mature leaves of the plant will look like. They don't take on whatever unique shape that they will in the future. They usually just look like big, fat ovals. They're known as cotyledons, which roughly translates to seed leaves. They actually exist in a very small form within the seed before it even germinates. And they are basically a storage organ for a lot of those nutrients and energy that that fresh young plant is going to use as it first starts to grow. And fortunately, there's in general a very easy division where we can separate plants that when they first germinate have one cotyledon leaf or two cotyledon leaves when they first come up. And we respectively refer to them as monocots and dicots. And I'll reference this as we talk about specific plants or specific types of plants in the future. There are some ways after the plant is mature that you can still be able to tell, oh, is it a monocot or is it a dicot? That'll help you distinguish it. But in general, it's a really good tool when you have the opportunity to see the plant when it's first germinating and it's first coming up, and you can make note of, oh, well, how many of those special first little leaves, those cotyledons, does the plant have? Move up to now. So now we're going to go over a lot of terminology. This is terminology.
We just got a question.
Go for it.
Is there an advantage of being a monocot versus a dicot?
Not yes and no. As with all evolutionary advantages as we understand them, it's not that plants as they evolve and gain these new strategies that they're getting better all the time. It's more a process of like, well, what was good enough to make it? And usually we can see variety in different locations and different environments because with different parameters, there are different body structures and different behaviors that can be good enough to allow you to procreate and continue. In general, if I remember correctly, and I'm not well versed in this, so don't quote me, but dicots actually came first. So as we understand it, the earliest vascular plants were dicots, and they had two cotyledon leaves. And somewhere along the line, there were different plants that branched off and would only produce one. So in and of itself, there isn't necessarily an advantage between one or the other. It's not automatically the case that dicotyledon means with that extra leaf is going to have that much more nutrition stored away, that it's automatically going to be better off than any monocot plant that's starting off and germinating. That's not necessarily the case, and again, it really depends on individual species and the environmental conditions that they're living in.
Awesome.
So we're going to get into terminology now. A lot of it, or a decent amount of it, hopefully is familiar to everybody. And so, if it's review, great. If it's new, great. And again, these visuals that I'm going over here, this is part of what we'll put out after the class. So don't feel like you have to furiously take a bunch of notes on this stuff. You're going to get this visual later on. And as you can see on the screen, let's start by talking about leaves. Leaves are something that came along with vascular plants, specialized tissues specifically for photosynthesis. This is where photosynthesis takes place, and because of that, we can appreciate their form of just, they're very thin and they're very broad, so they're catching as much of the light coming towards them as they can. We of course see lots of different forms of leaves out there, and as complex and varied as they can be, there are very simple rules that we can follow to make distinctions between them. And first, we have here the idea of simple versus compound leaves. As you can see by the visual, a simple leaf is usually a single leaf. A leaf as we think of as a wide, flat, in this case, an ovalish shape. It has veins running through it, which are vascular tissue that are going to funnel the sugars made by photosynthesis from all over that leaf down to that midrib, that center vein running down, and then down into the plant, into the twig, into the branch, into the trunk, and moving usually again down into the roots. The difference is the simple leaf, it's usually a single structure, whether it's a basic oval or whether it's something that has all kinds of lobes and a really frilly edge on it. It doesn't matter how crazy and complex the leaf looks. If it is a single leaf that connects to a branch, and most importantly, you will note where the leaf stem and the branch connect, there is a bud. Here it's defined as an auxiliary bud, basically just saying auxiliary bud. The word auxiliary is just referring to the fact that it is not the bud at the very tip of the branch where the newest growth is occurring. This is somewhere lower on the branch, and there will be a little bud and there will be a leaf coming off of it. A compound leaf, on the other hand, as we see, it looks like it might be multiple leaves all coming off of a branch. But instead of distinguishing each of them as individual leaves, we call them leaflets. And the reason that we make that distinction is because we can see the auxiliary bud is still in the same place. If on that compound leaf, if every single one of those little leaflets had its own little bud at the base of the leaf, then we would classify those as simple leaves on a branch. But because there is one auxiliary bud where the leaf, stem, and the branch meet, and then there are all these tiny little leaflets, and those leaflets don't have their own buds, we classify that as, okay, technically that's all one leaf still, and we call it a compound leaf. Depending on where you are in the world, some common examples of compound leaves might be pea plants or locusts or walnut trees. And again, the distinguishing feature is the location of that bud. A bud being a new growth site on the plant. It's a common misconception for some people that when plants need to make new leaves or make new branches and stems, that they can just grow them anywhere they want to, any part of their body. They can produce new tissue. That's not the case. There are very specialized locations that the plant has ready to go with young cells that are prepared to grow if and when necessary, when the plant deems that it needs that new tissue. But it can only grow from those specialized sites, and we call those sites buds. Now, of course, depending on the species of plant that you're looking at, it could have a very small amount of buds, very sparsely located around the plant, or you can have a stem that is just covered in buds to the point that it looks like it's bumpy. And those are the ones that they look like they grow crazy because they grow new leaves and branches all the time, and they grow them from wherever they want. However, it's not wherever they want. There is still a bud there. There has to be a bud in order for new growth on the plant to form. And so when we're looking at leaves and deciding are they simple or compound, we ask ourselves, where is the bud? Let me go to the base of the stem of this leaf. Do I see a bud? Then it's simple leaves. Do I not see a bud, but after I look at all 5 of these little leaflets and I run down the larger stem they're connected to, I see only one bud all the way down there, then it's a compound. Moving to the other half of this page, we have alternate versus opposite, and this is just referring to the position of leaves on a stem. And it is as simple as you see there. If the leaves are alternate, then you have an alternation of you have one on the right side, or you have one on one side, and then there is usually a gap of some kind between where that bud is forming, and then you have to go up the stem so far before there will be another bud, and that other bud will be on the opposite side of the stem. And so you have this alternating back and forth, opposed to opposite leaf patterns, where wherever there is a bud, a growth node, you will have 2 buds adjacent on either side of a stem, so that you can have leaves growing out on either side at the same point on the stem. And so you'll see sometimes it's more than 2 leaves, sometimes it might be 3, or as we'll see a visual later, any situation where there's a large number of leaves such that it looks like they're completely surrounding a stem, we call that a whorl, W-H-O-R-L, a whorl of leaves. However, usually when we refer to opposite, it's pretty clear that it's just pairs of leaves, groups of 2. There'll be 2 here, and then again there'll be a gap, because not every single part of the stem can grow new tissues, only where buds are. So there'll be 2 buds here, 2 leaves coming off. Then there'll be a gap of just normal stem tissue, and then up here, 2 buds, 2 leaves coming off. And so already we can use this lingo to help us really distinguish and understand unique differences between plants, because I can have combinations between simple and compound and alternate and opposite. So right off the bat, I can look at a plant, and these fortunately are usually pretty easy visual IDs. These are usually pretty easy things to distinguish without having to get up, looking at the plant really close, potentially even dissecting it a bit. There's certain ideas that you can do that for. Fortunately, not the case here. Before I even walk up to a plant, I can usually look at it and see, oh, it has simple opposite leaves, or it has compound alternating leaves. And that can give me a real big jump, especially in terms of IDing the plant. And basically, as with any organism that we're trying to ID, as we're learning more of this terminology, the ultimate goal is to, as quickly as possible, be able to weed options out. There are so many species of plants out there that you're better off working from a stance of, let me not immediately worry about exactly what this plant is if I don't know and I'm trying to ID it. Let me first worry about, well, what is it not? And that will allow me to take large numbers of species and immediately disqualify them and say, well, it can't be any of these, because I know all of these have compound leaves, and this plant clearly has simple leaves. So even just with these 4 terms, we're already well on our way. And let's move on from the leaves, the edges of the plant, shall we say, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about this page. I include this here purely as a reference source, and this is just to give you an idea of all of the terminology that is out there, for all the diversity of the shapes of leaves, the margins, what is the texture or shape of the edge of the leaf, the margin, and of course the venation, again, those specialized tissues within the leaf that act as pipes and are going to be moving material. They're moving water into the leaf, and they're moving nutrients produced from photosynthesis out of the leaf. But they take on all kinds of different patterns. Somebody asked me about monocots and dicots earlier. It's not necessarily that one is more advantageous than the other, but we can, as a general rule, look at the venation to determine whether or not it's a monocot or dicot. In general, and I will always preface that because if there's any solid rule in nature, it's that there's always an exception to the rule. So even if I say something definitively in this class, know that it is not definitive. There's always at least one species of plant out there that bucks the rule. However, in general, monocots, plants that have a single cotyledon when they first come up. When they get their mature leaves, the veins within those leaves will all be parallel, as we can see here, where I'm circling with my mouse. So you'll have many, many veins, but there's no branching at all. They're all running relatively parallel to each other, up and down the full length of the leaf. One example for this is all kinds of bulb plants. You know, if you've ever planted your tulips and your hyacinths, and your daisies and whatever, and when they come up, you take a really good look at their leaves. They look very smooth. You might not even notice the veins in them. And that's because they don't have some crazy branching structure like you might see on a lot of trees, like say a maple leaf. It's all just very smooth, straight lines. And all of those start out as monocots. Whereas something, again, like a maple tree that has a leaf that not only has a really cool shape and a margin to it, but the veins within it have a branching pattern, as if they're imitating the larger form of the tree. Where you have one vein, and you'll have at least two veins branching off of that, and even smaller veins branching off of those. Something more akin to this reticulate design that we see here. And in general, plants whose leaves take on this kind of venation tend to be dicots. Fun fact. Moving on from leaves now, let's go a little further down the plant. We've got the stems, the twigs, the branches. In general, all of those we can think of as synonyms. It really depends on the plant that you're looking at, and particularly the type of plant. You know, if it is a soft tissued little herbaceous plant, we tend to call them stems or shoots or something like that. Maybe if it's a perennial that puts on woody tissue, and those stems can get much, much larger, much more substantial, and again, perennial, where they'll persist year after year after year, maybe we're more likely to use a term like a branch. Regardless of those differences, we have important terms that we can look at regardless of the plant. And some of those I've kind of already talked about, and it's mainly these nodes. This node, the importance of a node is where a bud is. We can see here they're referred to as nodes. Here they're just referring to the bud, or the node being the entire area around that bud. You might see just the word node. You might see them classified as growth nodes, and that's basically just asserting the fact that this is an area on the plant where it can produce new tissue. That area in between the buds, in between the nodes, where no new growth can go on, as I mentioned before, we call that the internode space. The blade of a leaf is a pretty straightforward idea. The petiole of a leaf, the petiole is a word that you'll see come up from time to time. It's basically referring to the stem of the leaf. It is the small little stem of tissue that connects the body of the leaf to the stem or the branch that it's growing off of. Sometimes, depending on the guide you have, it might just call this a stem, the leaf stem. Depending if it's a different one, if it's trying to be a little more fancy or technical, it might refer to the petiole of the leaf. Or especially if it's a guide helping you ID, it might ask you questions about, well, what is the shape of the petiole? How does the blade or the body of the leaf connect to the petiole? As in, what I mean by that would be where they connect. So we have our main rib of a leaf, shall we say, and it comes down into the petiole here before it connects to a larger branch. Now the question is, whatever shape this leaf is, right down here, where the body of the leaf is going to meet the petiole, do we have a very even line between the two sides of the leaf? Sometimes we can have one lobe of the leaf coming much lower, something like that. Sometimes we can have a very unique shape where it furls out and then comes way far up again. Of course, there's all kinds of shapes that this can take. But lots of times, if you see a guide asking you questions about the petiole, it's usually asking about this area. What does it look like where the body of the leaf and the petiole meet? Or what does it look like where the petiole and the stem meet? Do I have one here? Of course, it's very small here. Oh, of course, here's where it zooms in here. We see the leaf scar. And the leaf scar is a specialized area where this petiole and the stem meet. When a leaf falls off, and of course, as we've all seen the vast majority of the time, it's not just the blade or the body of the leaf that's falling off, it's the whole stem, it's the whole petiole. The whole thing will fall off. And in its place, right below that bud that was at the node where that leaf was forming, there will be some type of scar. This will be a really good identifying feature. Depending on the plant, depending on the shape and size of the petiole, this scar that is left over when the leaf falls off can take all kinds of different forms to match the shape and size of the petiole. You'll also see there's these little dots in here. Those dots are actually the specialized tissues, the tubes, shall we say, that are moving material from that leaf through that petiole stem down into the larger stem or branch. And again, depending on the species of plant, there can be different arrangements and different numbers of these bundle scars, as they're known. These scars that indicate where special tissues like xylem and phloem were passing through. And so this can be an excellent ID tool, whether it's in the middle of winter and you just don't have any leaves to look off of, or even if the plant is in full leaf and you can just break a leaf off and see what does it leave behind. What is the shape and form that it leaves behind? Is that all I'm talking about there? I think so. Now let's get into flowers. More fun, more technical. So again, this is the angiosperms specifically that we're talking about. Angiosperm meaning a flowering plant, a plant that is producing a flower and is producing some kind of fruit to encase its seeds within. And we've got all kinds of parts here. But it's really these four main ones that I want you to worry about now. Again, if you want, there is a lot more out there. You can get a lot more complicated with flower anatomy. You can break down a lot of these terms into even smaller constituent parts in one form or another that you can learn about. But this is a standard good place to start from. Sepals, petals, stamens, and pistils. Now, when we look at a flower, and it doesn't matter what species we're looking at, what kind of unique shape, form, colors, whatever that this flower is taking on, all flowering plants are related. Rather, they are more closely related than non-flowering plants. They have a common ancestor as we think of it. And so we can appreciate that with all plants that produce flowers, they have, even in all of their diversity, a very similar system that they have to follow. The first thing that we can appreciate is all of these specialized structures within a flower, the petals, as we will discuss further, these different male and female parts that produce pollen or collect pollen and move that pollen down into the ovaries for for fertilization, for seed production. All of these things were originally, way back in evolutionary time, leaves. They're leaves that in different ways have become specialized. The plant, the species over time has changed them and adapted them based off of just it working, it becoming beneficial to them in order to use them for different purposes. And so it helps to appreciate that, as extreme and strange as it may seem, all these different parts of the plant we can think of as super specialized leaves that are no longer have anything to do with photosynthesis. However, they originally started out as leaves. The sepal, as we see here, is always on the outside, usually around the base of the flower. They look, most of the time, very similar to leaves. They're usually green. They're usually ovalish or flat discs in some way. And they're predominantly used to protect the flower, especially before the flower has opened up. When it's just a bud that's starting to form, it's a protective casing that helps that soft tissue not get damaged by anything, by excessive heat and radiation from the sun, by cold temperatures from wind or rain, sudden flash freezes that happen really early in the spring when we don't want them to. The sepal can help protect the growing flower bud within. Once it is ready, these sepals will part. They will open up in some fashion, allowing all the other specialized parts of the flower to come out and develop. Petals, everybody knows petals, everybody sees petals. Again, they're really just specialized leaves. They're not green, they don't photosynthesize anymore because they have a new task to perform for the plant, and that is usually to attract pollinators. Because we're far past the point of just throwing our spores out into water or wind and hoping that they make it. With flowering plants, we have countless generations of coexistence between animals and plants, particularly animals that we refer to as pollinators, insects, flying animals like hummingbirds and bats that take advantage of what these specialized flower structures are producing, realizing, hey, we can use that as food. And the plant in return realizing, hey, if I can attract these different organisms and feed them a little bit, then, as we all understand pollination, they'll likely get some of my pollen on their body somewhere. And then when they go to another flower to feed on more food, they are that much more likely to have my pollen rub off. And I am able to procreate with a different individual, somebody that I can't walk over to because I'm a plant and I'm rooted in the ground. So very advanced structure, not just in and of itself, but in the history that was required between plants and animals. This long, again, countless generations forming these complex symbiotic relationships where two different kinds of organisms are truly dependent on each other at this point. Flowering plants are incredibly successful, partly because the animals that serve as their pollinators are so successful. Without those animals, flowering plants really don't have any backup strategy of, oh, well, we didn't get pollinated by the normal person. That's okay. We can just we can do this other strategy instead. Most of the time, if flowering plants don't get pollinated by the necessary animal, then they're just out of luck that year. They don't get to procreate. There are, of course, some plants that can self-pollinate, that they don't need a different partner plant to give pollen to or collect pollen from. These self-pollinating plants, we specifically refer, when we're looking at their flowers, what we're really looking at is that, as with this example flower, they have both pistils and stamens. The pistil is the female part of the plant. It usually comprises of three parts. The stigma at the very top. This is usually noticeable if you look at the flower in some way. And then there will be a long stem running down from the stigma, which we refer to as the style. It's basically just a hollow tube that connects the stigma down into the ovaries. Depending on the plant, this ovary can be very noticeable. It can be like inside the flower and you can see it. It can be contained within the plant underneath the flower, and maybe you see the flower, and then underneath the flower here, there'll be like a large bulbous knot or something that is actually the ovaries contained deep within. This is the female part of the flower because its function is to collect pollen on the stigma and then transport the necessary genetic material from that pollen down the style into the ovaries. The ovules, as they are listed here, each separately have to be pollinated. And once they have been fertilized by pollen, each ovule separately will turn into a seed that can be dispersed. Depending on the plant, there are different numbers of ovaries, and there are different numbers of ovules within those ovaries, relating to the number of seeds that that plant can produce. We'll also find that these pistils can be good distinguishing features because depending on the type of plant, There might be only one pistil, there might be two, there might be three. And so we can get an idea by looking inside the flower. So that's the female part of the flower. That's the receptive part that is trying to collect and use pollen to fertilize its ovaries. What about the male part of the flower? We refer to that as the stamen. And the stamen is as simple as it is a pollen production machine. We're talking about countless, thousands upon thousands of individual grains of pollen being produced on this tip here, this specialized structure that we refer to as an anther. Depending on the species of plant we're looking at, this can take on different shapes and forms, but it's usually some little blip or some little cell here just floating on the end of what we call the filament, which is just a long tube basically holding it in place. In plants that exist that still do not require pollination by an animal, as in they are still pollinated by wind predominantly, we will see these anthers. They will usually be on very, very long filaments, such that they will stick out of the flower and they'll be dangling out, making it that much more easy for the anther to get caught in the wind and for the pollen that it's producing to blow away. However, in the case of flowering plants, angiosperms that are getting pollinated by an organism, there are usually just enough stamens and they are positioned within the flower, be it very low down or very high. They're positioned in such a way to try and guarantee that any pollinator that comes in to collect some of the nectar that the plant is, or that the flower is offering, will have to rub up against the stamen, whether it has to completely walk past it or whether maybe the anthers are located right where the nectar is, thereby guaranteeing that anybody that's trying to get to the nectar is just going to be right in there rubbing themselves with pollen as much as they can. And then by a similar fashion, we'll see in flowers that the pistil is usually arranged such that any incoming pollinator that hopefully already has some pollen on it from another individual in the same species will have to pass over that pistil, and the likelihood of them having to touch it and some of that pollen catching onto the pistil will occur. If we look at pollen at a microscopic level, it has all kinds of little hooks in it. It's like Velcro, and that's what makes it very easily stick to a lot of different organisms, especially ones that have hair of any kind or fur. And then, yeah, again, that's anything from the feathers of hummingbirds to the fur of bats to the fur or fluff or pubescence, whatever you want to call it, that you find on insects like bumblebees and honeybees. So this little Velcro covered pollen produced on the anther very easily sticks to these organisms. And then the surface, surprise, surprise, the surface of the pistil is not super smooth. It actually has edges and rough bits of its own, perfectly made for the Velcro bits of pollen to grasp onto. Once they've grasped onto here, there's a chemical reaction that occurs, basically telling the pollen, hey, you're in the right place, it's time. And then that pollen will break open, kind of like a seed germinating and breaking open. And that pollen will produce a specialized tube that will grow, and that tube will grow and run all the way down the style, and it will find an individual ovule that it can connect with. And that is how the process of fertilization in a flower in general occurs. So we have all these different parts that all work together. Again, the shape and size of these different parts, the numbers of these different parts will be drastically different depending on what species we're looking at. However, because all flowering plants have this common ancestry, we can fortunately say with confidence that they have these four parts at least. They have sepals, they have petals, they have stamens, and they have pistils. There are some plants that won't have all four of these, or maybe they have all four, but one of them is very hard to find. For example, there are plenty of plants that technically have sepals, however, they're so small and they don't form into something big and impressive. Maybe they're just vestigial and the plant doesn't even really use them for protection anymore. and you may never notice them unless you're really looking for them and you have a magnifying glass to like turn a flower over and look for these little nubs right at the base of the petals. So, you know, you may not see sepals all the time. You may not see the pistil all the time, depending on the design of the flower. However, we know that we can look for it and that that is a good ID tool. I tell them in this order, these sepals, petals, stamens, pistils. I encourage that that is the order that you should look at them in, because that is the order that they occur moving from the outside to the inside of the flower. So it's easy to look for sepals because they're always going to be on the outside. They're always going to be at the base of the flower. They're always going to be outside of the petals. So we can look for sepals. Are there sepals? How many of them are there? What shape do they take on? What is the orientation that they're laid out in around the stem of the flower? And then we can do the same moving inward. Are there petals? How many petals are there? What shape and size and color do they take on? Are they oriented in a perfect spiral, or does there seem to be groupings of petals in different ways? And then again, same for the stamens. How many stamens are there? What size are they? And then inevitably in the center of the flower, if we're going to find a pistil, it's going to be in the center. And we can see, is there a pistil? What shape and size does it take on? How many are there? There are many situations where there can be more than one pistil technically. However, they have fused together. And so at first, oh, it just looks like one big rod, one long style, one pistil. However, maybe if we look a little closer, we see that, oh, it's actually 3 or 4 stigma all sticking off of the same pistil or of the same style. And we can appreciate, oh, it actually appears that there's more than one, and they've fused together in the process of growing. Depending on what type of plant we're looking at, that can be a common feature. So always good to look for these 4 things, and always good to note how are they manifesting. Okay, this again is just a reference sheet. This is just to give you an idea of the diversity that is out there. Inflorescence in general, we just use as a term to refer to a flower stalk that is producing multiple flowers. We're not talking about a daisy here, where there's a single stalk and there's a single big pretty flower that comes off of it. We're talking about something that has usually a large amount of flowers, so many that it's difficult to count all of them individually. We refer to these as the inflorescence of the plant. And of course, there are all kinds of shapes and sizes that this inflorescence can take. And there are all kinds of words that we use to refer to their layout. Some of them are going to be more familiar. Scape is a pretty common one that we see here, a single stalk with a bunch of flowers, individual flowers coming off of the same point on the stalk. The most common example here would be something like allium plants, like onions or garlic. A common food this time of year, especially a lot of people, if you're working with a local CSA, you're probably getting garlic scapes right now, which basically is just the immature flower of the garlic. And it is a single stem like this that comes off of the garlic and will form a large head of flowers right at the top. So we refer to it as a scape, as opposed to something like an umbel or an umbel. This is another very common structure that we see a lot of times, or at least we see it because a lot of flowers that we like take on this form. A common wildflower example here in the eastern US would be Queen Anne's lace. And we see this structure where, like the scape, we have a bunch of flowers, stems coming off of the initial stem. However, if we look closer, they're not individual flowers. There's a whole separate bracket of even smaller flower stems coming off of each of these. And this structure is what we call an umbel, specifically compound, because it's basically an umbel growing off of an umbel. These will usually form a very flat disc shape on top, so that maybe if you're looking at the plant from above, it all looks like it's one large structure. It it might look like it's one big giant flower. However, the closer you get, the closer that you inspect it and maybe pull apart these individual stems, you can see, oh, it's actually very, very tiny flowers that are all connected to larger stems that group together in the same spot lower on the branch of the plant. So those are just some examples. Catkins we most commonly see on trees and perennial shrubs. They're pretty nondescript in terms of flowers. They're not very showy. Lots of plants that do wind pollination will have catkins. However, there are some that get pollinated by insects still that will produce just these little strands of dangling flowers, almost like grapes on the vine kind of thing.
We have a few questions.
Yeah.
One of them was back on your sepal slide. The number of the sepals, is it the same number as the petals?
Not necessarily. And I'll have some examples that we'll get into later. But that can be a really good ID feature to know how many sepals and how many petals, and can you tell the difference between the two? So there are plenty of examples where it is the same number, 3 sepals, 3 petals, 5 sepals, 5 petals. However, it varies one plant to another.
How does the division of the oval work after fertilization? Is there an oddball?
An oddball? I'm not sure what you mean by that, but basically.
That was my question, Taylor.
Yeah.
I was curious, isn't there like a division where there's like the pollen fertilizes an egg that divides into 3 eggs, but then there's a 4th that is it has a term for it, and I can't remember the term.
You're definitely hitting on something. You're correct there. I'm not going to get into it too much,
okay,
because you can take a whole college course on plant procreation at that level. There's a lot more fun terminology you can use that we don't get into tonight. However, since you brought it up, it is technical. It helps our understanding a lot to think of this is the female part of the plant and this is the male part of the plant. But yes, if we are being technical, ovules are not gendered in terms of the genetic material that they contain. And it is only after that fertilization occurs, it is only after the plant is getting ready for that fertilization that yes, those ovules there will be cell division and they will grow and change into a totally new form where we wouldn't even call them ovules anymore. Again, this is a loose analogy, but maybe we could think of ovules as stem cells, where just like they're very basic and they're at a point that like they could be anything. And when the plant is getting ready for that pollination to occur, the ovules, there will be cell division, they will grow, and they will turn into a totally new structure. And that new structure is what will actually produce the eggs. And so that new structure is technically the female part of the plant. And it's the same with pollen production, where initially it's this very simple little structure it's kind of like a stem cell. It could be anything. And there's a special chemical chain of events that has to occur to say, okay, we're going to cause cell division, we're going to grow and form the male pollen grains. And so, initially in both parts of the plant, there is no gender. And there is a very special chain of events that has to occur in order for the quote unquote sexual structures to form that will then actually fuse together as part of procreation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Another question, did the plants with male and female versus hermaphroditic flowers evolve in parallel, or does one have the advantage in nature?
Yeah, good question. This is another case of it really depends. It really depends on the individual species and the history of the environment that it grew up in and the types of pressures that it was encountering. I don't know the statistics to say there are more hermaphrodites out there versus there are not. I don't know which is more prevalent within the plant world, but there is numerous examples of both. And in fact, yeah, I didn't get into this yet. So one distinction that we will make when we're talking about the flower of a plant is whether or not it's perfect. There are perfect flowers and there are non-perfect, or usually we just call them flowers. Perfect flowers are not just super pretty or something like that. Perfect means that the flower contains both the stamen and the pistil, the male and female parts of the plant. Most of the time, perfect flowers can pollinate themselves. They're self-pollinating. And we would term them hermaphrodites because of that. However, there are just as many examples of plants that have separate male and female plants and separate male and female flowers. And so that is also an important distinguishing tool when we are trying to identify different species. What else did I want to say with that? And then there are all kinds of combinations there where, like, you can have a plant that produces perfect flowers and it can self-pollinate. That doesn't mean that it has to self-pollinate. That might mean it likes to cross-pollinate to get genetic diversity. However, worst case scenario, if it doesn't get pollinated, that's okay, it can pollinate itself. You have plants that will separately produce distinct male and female flowers, but they will both be on the same plant. You'll just be looking at one plant and you'll have to point out, like, that is a male flower, that one's a male flower, that one's a female flower. And then there are species where the sexes are totally distinct in that you'll have the first example that comes to mind for this is holly trees. A lot of people, especially people that like the beauty of the red fruit, the berries that will form on a holly tree, they very quickly learn that you need a male tree and a female tree because each plant will only produce flowers of one sex. And therefore, you're not going to get any berries if you only have a bunch of females or you only have a bunch of males. So there is all kinds of variety out there in the plant world of hermaphrodites, of separate individuals, of separate individual flowers, separate male and female flowers on the same plant, or totally separate individuals with male or female flowers.
Two quick fire questions. Are grasses inflorescence and is milkweed an umbel?
Milkweed, I probably would call milkweed an umbel. I don't know technically. It would not be compound as this one is here. Again, compound refers to the idea that we have all these stems of flowers, or we have all these flower stems coming off of the same point, but then we have that exact same structure where this stem ends in a point that is the origin for a bunch of other flower stems. We could have this where this is one flower, this is one flower, this is one flower, and that is what you would find on a milkweed plant. So it could be an umbel as far as I'm not familiar enough. There, of course, even this is not a comprehensive list of inflorescences, so it might be something not featured on here, but you would have to check because I'm not confident enough or I don't have the memory. It could be an umbel like this, or it could be a corum like here, depending on the structure of those individual flower stems and how and where are they coming off of the plant stem to form this field or this head of flowers that all come up to the same point together. But that's a good question. I'm not sure. And sorry, what was the other one?
Is grasses inflorescence?
Yes. Grasses are not inflorescences. They do not have an inflorescence. They have individual flowers. Inflorescence only refers to when there's a bunch of distinct flowers growing from the same point or the same area, from the same stalk. Grasses produce just one one flower here, one flower there, and we'll talk about them a little more. They're very unique in that the grasses are still an example of a type of plant that is wind pollinated. All grasses, I don't care what species, I don't care where on the earth you are, all grasses are wind pollinated still. And that has led to some very unique features where, yes, technically they are flowering plants, they do produce a flower. However, because they don't need to attract any kind of organism to their flower, it's very nondescript. They don't have showy petals. They will still have structures that match this idea of like sepals and petals. However, they don't look anything like sepals and petals as we would think of in quote unquote normal flowering plants. So yes, grasses are technically flowering plants. They are angiosperms. However, because of their need only for wind pollination, their flowers are very unique. They're not very impressive. And there are even totally different descriptive words to refer to the different parts of grass plants in general, but including grass plant flowers because they're so unique. And again, I can get into that a little later on.
Awesome, thank you.
I went over that already. Okay. And this is, we're actually going to move on now to the grasses and other things. This is the last slide that I have in this little PDF I made. This is for anybody that needs the refresher or the learning. This is a visual of the tree of life. I like this visual because it shows us the idea of how with each successive level of taxonomy, of naming, as we call it. Taxonomy is the science of naming things and classifying them. As we get more and more specific, as we get closer and closer to an individual species, we see that each category is nested within the previous category. And so even though all of these pods or whatever we want to call them are all the same size and shape, we can appreciate that life comprises all forms of life. And then we can go to a specific domain within that, and we can go to a specific kingdom within that, in our case, the plant kingdom. And so each time we're getting successively more specific, but we are nested within the larger grouping above that we already classified. The standard way that within the scientific community that we name organisms, the fancy way we would say it is binomial nomenclature, which basically just means two names. And the two names are the genus and the species. For anybody that's heard the confusing botanical names or the proper names of different organisms, it's all in Latin. It seems like that's convoluted, that's confusing. Why would we name everything for this dead language that nobody speaks anymore? I don't know who originally chose Latin, you know, some European scientists, but it works, and we still do it to this day, basically because it's a way that we can get consensus. It's a very quick way that we can say, okay, here's this plant. It's very prolific. It's found in places all over the world, which means that a lot of different people interact with it, which means that a lot of different people have different names for it. And there can be a lot of confusion if, you know, I'm trying to talk about plant A and I show it to you and you say, that's not A, that's B. And we get into an argument when in fact we're technically in agreement. It's the same species that we're talking about, but there's confusion because we have different names for it. So all of the different names that people use throughout the world that are not the scientific Latin name, we call the common name. So there's the common name and the scientific name. We use the scientific name so that we get total consensus of like, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, it doesn't matter what language you speak. If I give you the Latin name of an organism, you immediately know exactly what I'm talking about. And so when we're looking at different plants, especially if we're looking at a really good guide or key that's trying to help us identify them, you'll get some common names. You'll get an idea of like, yeah, this is what most people call it. But more importantly, you'll get that Latin binomial name. which is the genus and the species. And we'll see some examples of this coming up. Here at the bottom, I added all these other terms. This is basically just, there are all kinds of ways that people will make even smaller subdivisions nested within the idea of species, whether it's a subspecies or a varietal. A cultivar usually refers to something that specifically has been bred to distinguish a certain feature of the organism. Whereas a hybrid, of course, we think of as two separate, unique individuals within a species intentionally being bred together to form something unique. There's all kinds of different words that people use out there, and unfortunately for a lot of these, there isn't total consensus on what they mean or how we use them. So, you know, appreciate and use these words as you see fit. However, in terms of the science of taxonomy and the scientific naming of organisms, we focus on this rank system here, and more specifically on the genus and species. However, what I want to focus on is one rung up on the ladder, are the families, because it is at the family level that we can really start to use some distinguishing features for identification. And this is, frankly, this is really convenient for us, because at the family level, we can still have groups. We can have a family of plants that is thousands and thousands of species of plants that are all classified as being closely enough related that we call them a family. However, even with so many individual species that we're referring to, we can still pull out very specific rules by which we can go off of to classify them. Things like, does it have a flower? If so, how many sepals does the flower have? How many petals? What arrangement are the stamens in? And that's what we're going to get into now. I've listed 8 families here. You'll notice again, this is the Latin name for all these families. So it seems very foreign and confusing, maybe even difficult to pronounce. You don't need to worry about that. Just getting familiar with the visual of the word. So when you see it later, you can be familiar. You'll notice that all of these family names end in AE. That is by convention. And this is not just within the plant world. This is within taxonomy. All family names have an AE ending. And for these different rungs of classification, you'll tend to find some kind of theme in the way that the words are created or spelled out. So automatically here, even if I didn't have the labeling, by seeing the AE endings on all of these, I would know, okay, we're referring to different families of organisms. In this case, specific plant families. So let's talk about some plant families. I picked those 8 ones in particular because they are 8 of the most common ones that you are going to encounter. The most common families, as in there are going to be lots of opportunities, or I'm sorry, there are going to be lots and lots of plants out there that fall into these families, thousands and thousands of plants. However, again, when especially if we're out in the field, we don't have a lot of resources on us. Maybe we don't have the internet, or we certainly don't want to lug a bunch of books out on a hike with us every single time we go out. There can be these very convenient ID tools that help us rule a lot of things out. And we can say, okay, we've noticed this unique feature of the plant, which means it definitely can't be anything in that family, which means we just ruled out those 3,000 species. And it definitely can't be this family, which means we just ruled out another 2,000 species, you know. So it's great that we can really, you know, when we're starting just with the potential of this could be any plant, we use these identifying features to, as quickly as we can, narrow it down. And so let's get into some of that now. First, we have the mint family, which is Lamiaceae, Lamiaceae. But we know it as the mint. The common name is the mint family. This comprises over 3,000 species of plants worldwide. What are the distinguishing features of them? They have simple opposite leaves, which means every individual leaf, it's not going to be a bunch of different leaflets. It's not a compound leaf. It's going to be one very distinguishable leaf. and the leaves are opposite, which means that we're going to see them in pairs, where there's two leaves growing off opposite sides of a stem at the node, at the place where the bud is, and then there's going to be an internode space where there's no growth going on, and then there's going to be another bud, another node, and we're going to see two leaves growing off in opposite directions at that same location, opposite leaves. Another big distinguishing feature of mints is that their stalks, their stems, tend to be square, such that in certain species, that stem is thick and fat enough that you can barely clearly see the sides and the edges. And you can see that is definitely square. There are some situations where maybe that stem is very, very thin or very small. You can't visually see that it is square. However, if you run it between your fingers, as it rolls, you'll feel the edges. You'll feel that it's not smooth. So that square stalk can be really good. There are lots of other plants that have these similar features, like square stems and opposite leaves. You know, there's things like verbena or stinging nettles, for example, that follow these same features. So those are good tools that we can use, but it's not enough for us to distinguish that it's a mint plant. First, so we need more clues. How can we nail down that, like, I don't know what this plant is, but it's definitely in the mint family because it's got the simple leaves, they're simple opposite leaves, and the square stalks. What else? Well, the easiest one, lots of times before we even get up to the plant to notice its leaf structure, is that we can smell it. The vast majority of plants in the mint family are very aromatic, which is why we love them so much. You know, there's all the complex chemical compounds that these different species produce is what attracts us and is what makes them really stick out to us and makes us desire them enough to cultivate them and consume them for different purposes. So we've got the square stalk, very aromatic. That's not necessarily the case for every mint plant, and there are plenty of other plants out there that aren't in the mint family, the Lamiaceae family, that are aromatic. So how could we pin it down even more? Let's look at the flower. This is going to be the best tool. If, you know, when in doubt, you can always go to the flower because flowers get very specific. So the flowers on plants in the mint family are perfect, which means every individual flower has male and female parts. All right, it's going to have the pistil and the stamen. They have 5 sepals. Let's go in the order of sepals, petals, stamens, pistils. So mint plants, the flower will always have 5 sepals, 5 petals, 4 stamens, 1 pistil. And this is the kind of thing I can say from experience, like memorizing numbers like that, it can really help so that you just go out in the field and you say, oh, mint, 5541. And then you know, sepals, petals, stamens, pistils. Those 5 sepals are usually combined. Depending on the guide you're using, it might say that they're united. It might say that they're fused. But what this basically means is instead of noticing individual, instead of at the base of the flower, there are individual sepals like this. If they're combined or they're fused, it'll usually look like one that has a lot of different lobes. So it'll look like they're all combined when technically, when they were younger and more immature, there were separations here. There was a separation here and here. However, as they grew and matured, they fused together. And so now it looks like one single structure. However, if I count the nodes or the leaflets, we'll call them, I'll find that there are 5. This is the same for the flowers of mint plants. There are 5 petals. However, they tend to be fused together in different ways. We tend to even see, you'll have 2 of the petals are sticking up and 3 of the petals are sticking down. At the base, where they're all meeting, is where they kind of fuse. And so if you look, it might seem like, oh, they're all coming from the same point. But no, they all started out separate. And as they matured and grew larger and larger, they fused together over time. Next, we have stamens going in. We're looking at the male pollen-producing part of the flower, the stamens. There are 4 stamens in mint plants, and there's fortunately a distinguishing feature. I don't know the reasoning behind this, but in all mint flowers, 2 of the stamens are short and 2 of the stamens are long. So you'll see 4 of them, and you'll see a very distinct height difference between the stamens going on in the flower. Where do I want to go from here? For each of these, I'll give examples, common examples of the plants that exist. Again, the mint family worldwide, we're talking about over 3,000 species of plants. But a lot of them and a lot of the growing number of these species comes through human cultivation of things like mints and basils, rosemary and lavender and thyme and sage and savory. But there are lots of more ornamental plants like coleus that are classified in the mint family. The easiest way that you can tell that coleus is in the mint family is because of the very distinct square stems that it has. So this is an example, like some really, now that I know it's a lot, again, especially if it's all new, but we can see that with just a new handful of terms at our disposal, we can make very important distinctions that can help us really narrow down what is this plant. So that's it for the mint family, and I'm just going to go through the others now. The next family that I'll talk about is the parsley family, the Apiaceae or Apiaceae, A-P-I-A-C-E-A-E. But again, just the parsley family of plants. This is, the last I checked, it was like pushing 4,000 different species of plants worldwide. So again, quite a few of them. Their most distinguishing feature, I'm sorry, I'll talk about the leaves first. They have compound leaves. So we're going to have multiple little leaflets coming off of the same growth point, the same node. So for every single bud on the plant, there's going to be not just one leaf with one blade, but multiple leaflets that maybe all look like leaves on their own. However, they don't have buds at the base of every single leaf. So that is how we know it's a compound leaf, and it is alternate. So again, or alternate meaning that you'll have leaf growing out on one side on a bud, then there'll be the internode space where nothing's going on, and then at the next bud, you'll have a leaf growing in the opposite direction. However, unlike the opposite, where you have 2 leaves growing both directions at each node, you only have one in one direction. So you'll alternate between the 2. So parsley plants have compound alternate leaves, which is a good start, but again, there's a lot of families of plants out there that have that combination. That's not enough. What else can we look at? Well, as with all of these, the flower will be the best way to ID the plant because it tends to be the most unique part of the plant in one way or another. And for parsley, for plants in the parsley family, we don't even have to look that close at the flowers themselves. We can just look at the structure. Parsley plants have an inflorescence, which is the compound umbel, which, let me pull that up again. If I can. Well, that's going to take me too long. The umbel is the idea we described of you have a single flower stem. You have a single flower stem with multiple shoots branching off of it. And usually all of the flowers at the tips of these stems will come to the same height. They'll form a flat layer, or they'll form a slightly curved disc like this. And they'll all grow such that it looks, again, from the top, it'll all look like one big flower. However, if you look from the side, or you look underneath, you'll notice they're all coming off of separate stems originating from the same point. The term umbel, as you can get an idea of from my little illustration here, is similar to the word umbrella, and that is the kind of shape that we're referring to when we say an umbel. It is an umbrella shape. Now, if there is an individual flower at the end of each of these stalks, that is an umbel, or that is a simple umbel. A compound, we double it basically. We have this umbel with all of these separate shoots coming off, and then at the tip of each of these, we have a bunch more branches coming off. And it is only at the bases of this secondary branching, or at the tips, I'm sorry, of this secondary branching, where the flowers actually occur. So we can think of it as an umbel on top of an umbel. And this is compound. So when we have this structure, this is a compound umbel. And that is what parsley plants have. Everything in the parsley family, the flower or the inflorescence, the grouping of flowers, is known as a compound umbel. So that is a really good distinguishing feature to look for. If you want to look at the individual flowers within, at the tips of each of those umbel structures, there are patterns that you can find. Usually they're so small that first of all, it's really hard to see with the naked eye. If you want to get a magnifying glass or something, you can look at these flowers more easily. They do technically have sepals, but they're usually so small that they're really not noticeable at all. So if you want to look very closely at parsley flowers, you'll find that there are 5 petals and there are 5 stamens. And then there's usually a single pistil sticking out of the center of it. But again, the individual flowers, the individual flower being, you know, this would be one flower, this would be one flower, this would be one flower. Each of those individuals, they're so small that while we can definitively say that there are distinguishing features to them, it's usually not worth your time to get out your magnifying glass and look at something that tiny. You're much better off just recognizing this larger form, this umbel, or in the case of the parsley family, this compound umbel that's going on. All right. There are a lot of parsley plants that are also very aromatic in a different way than the mints, of course. And this tends to be the desirable feature of why we've cultivated a lot of them. Again, we've got things like anise and celery and coriander, caraway and cumin, fennel, parsley, and of course carrots. Carrots are probably the most common example. Queen Anne's lace, which I mentioned earlier, a very common wildflower in our part of the world here in Foxhaven, are the distant wild relatives of carrots. That's a fun fact for anybody. So a lot of really great, desirable, edible species within the parsley family. However, also some of the most poisonous plants, at least that we can find here in North America. The number one example being poison hemlock, which for anybody that's looked into this already can appreciate that Queen Anne's lace, a very pretty and edible plant, edible because it's the wild relative of carrot, looks very, very similar to poison hemlock. And poison hemlock is not just a little bit poisonous and it'll make you a little sick. It is very toxic, and it is very easy to die from consuming it. So that, again, that compound umbel is a really great distinguishing feature that we can help narrow it down to say, like, okay, this is definitely some type of parsley plant that we're looking at. However, especially if you're looking at a plant thinking from the perspective of foraging it and consuming it, this is a family that you want to be really, really careful with your ID. It's not enough. In the mint family, for example, the vast, vast majority of that approximately 3,000 species of mints are all edible. They're not going to bother you, and if anything, they're going to be desirable because they're producing this really aromatic oils and other chemicals. Not the case with parsley. Not the case that we can just rely on, like, oh, it's definitely parsley and it smells good, so I should eat it. No, you could really risk your health and your life in that situation. So I won't get into more specifics of like, here's how you identify hemlock, but just know that this is an example where if you're identifying for the purpose of consumption, you need to get much more specific in your identification than just the family. Again, these are great ID tools to help us narrow things down, but even if I can get to the point of saying, this is definitely a parsley plant, that's still approximately 4,000 different species of plants that I have to then say, okay, let me get more specific. Let me use a guide or a key to figure out what this is. That being said, just knowing it is a parsley plant, just narrowing it down to just those 4,000 species can make a world of difference in terms of trying to identify it. It's much easier instead of starting at the very beginning of a guide and just kind of like wandering through it as you flip and just like, I'm looking for something that kind of visually looks similar to this. No, if you're able to have this handful of ID tools that you can confidently say, it's definitely a parsley, it's definitely an Apiaceae, and you can go to your guide or you can go to your ID key and start, flip back to page 200 or whatever, where it has gotten specific enough that it's only talking about parsley plants, then you've saved yourself so much time already. So it's great to be able to do that, but it's not the end. It's not enough to just say, I figured out what family it is. Delve a little deeper. Look for more specific characteristics that distinguish different species within the same family. But we're going to move on to another family. We're going to talk about the mustard family, or the Latin name, the Brassicaceae family. This is one where a lot of people are common with the Latin name. This is the family of brassica plants, a large number of which have been cultivated by humans in one form or another. Even so, there are many, many, many wild versions of mustard out there. This is another one. There are approximately 4,000 species of mustard plants worldwide. Their leaves are simple and opposite. Their flowers, the flowers of mustards are also perfect, meaning they have both male and female parts. So if necessary, they can self-pollinate. However, they prefer cross-pollination, better genetic diversity. And something I don't think I got into yet is the idea of regular versus irregular flowers. So a regular flower is one where the sepals and the petals, the sepals all the way on the outside and the petals the next part in, they're all going to be very similar shape and size, such that it might be hard to distinguish one from another. And also they're usually arranged they're arranged in a pattern around the flower. Usually they're very equidistant, such that I could draw a line through the flower at multiple points and I could get a mirror image. Let me draw an example to illustrate that. So there are some flowers out there. Let's say now, of course, that's not perfect, but let's imagine it is perfect. And we can see, okay, there's 6 petals. They're all about the same size and the same shape and likely the same color. Maybe technically, if we look a little closer, maybe if we look at this flower from the side, we see, oh, actually only 3 of these are petals and the other 3 are sepals. They just look very similar in shape and size and form. Whatever the case, whether we distinguish these as sepals and petals or all petals, whatever, the idea is that they are all similar. They are all pretty equidistant, such that I could draw a line through and I could get a mirror image. The flower is going to look the same on both sides. And, again, if I can do this from multiple points, that is what we think of as a regular flower. So, here's another, I can draw a line here, mirror image on either side of the line, etc. If I have a flower that is not so perfect looking, or I'm sorry, not so regular looking like this, maybe some of the petals take on very unique shapes that not all of the petals do. Something like a pea plant or pea flower, for example, which I'll get into in a minute. those are irregular flowers. So mustard plants have regular flowers because they have 4 sepals and 4 petals. And again, they're very evenly arranged around the flower such that I can draw lines through it and I can get mirror images very easily. It's a very simple, pleasing design. This is another one where there are multiple stamens. There tend to be 6 stamens for every mustard flower, and we get the difference in height, like I mentioned earlier. So there tend to be 6 stamens, and 2 of them are short, and 4 of them are long. So again, this is a good tool when we're getting really close. We're looking at the flower closer and closer. So we have our flower stem. We've gone past the sepals. We've gone past the petals, and now we're looking at the stamens. And so in this case, we're going to have 2 that are short and then 4 that are longer. Now, of course, from a distance, you would never notice that difference in height. It's going to take you getting up close, and it's going to take you noticing those differences. It's going to take you counting those individual stamens, which can be tricky. They're not always that big. However, it can be, again, a really good distinguishing feature. Not just, in this case for mustard, not just that there are 6 stamens, but that they're in different positions. And again, there's always the exception to the rule. However, we're talking about thousands of species, thousands and thousands of species that follow this rule, that match this idea well enough that we can say definitively, mustard plants look for 6 stamens, 2 short, 4 long. So what do we have? We have 4 sepals, 4 petals, 6 stamens, and again, 1 pistil in the middle that's receiving any incoming pollen. Mustard plants in general grow very, very quickly. They are adapted for disturbed areas, bare ground, and so we tend to see them come up really fast in the springtime, whenever that is. They tend to grow very quickly. They tend to flower and go to seed very quickly, and they're dropping seed before a lot of other plants are even coming out of the ground and producing a lot of biomass. So sometimes you're much more likely to catch the mustard plant after it has flowered, and you'll just see a bunch of seed pods hanging off of it. Depending on what species, the seed pods of mustard plants can take many different shapes and sizes. Some of them look very much like peas or legumes, where it's like a pod with a line of seeds growing inside of it. Some of them are much more circular, and it's just like a big ball of seeds that you can shake it and you can hear the seeds rolling around inside. So all kinds of different seed pod designs. But a good distinguishing feature is that they're always going to occur in the exact same pattern on the plant that the flowers did. And this is the case in general with all flowers, that the seeds are going to form in the ovary at the base of the flower. Again, depending on the species, it could be the base of the, depending on the species, the base of the flower could be in a different place. So you could have a flower, comes up, and maybe the ovary is right here. It's actually inside the flower. And then, you'll have the pistil coming up and the stamens coming up like that. So that might actually be noticeable. You could walk up and look at the flower and see, oh, look at the bulbous ovary right at the base of the petals like that. In a totally different plant, you could have the ovary completely underneath the flower, such that you have this big bulbous area before you have your sepals and petals and stamens, etc. So you can have very different locations. However, there's never a unique case of like the fruit is going to form in a totally different location on the plant than where the flower is. No, it's all right here. So if you get familiar with the pattern that mustard plants, that brassica plants form on the stalk. And it is an inflorescence where you'll have a single flower stalk coming up and lots of individual flowers forming off of that. It'll form a very specific pattern. It almost kind of looks like a spiral. If you were to look at it from the top, you'll see it just, at first it just looks like a bunch of spokes with a bunch of individual flowers coming off, but they actually form a spiraling pattern as they go up the stalk. And that pattern will persist. You won't just suddenly have like a bunch of totally new seed pods growing wherever. There's going to be one seed pod per flower stem. So each one of those flowers will turn into its own pod, and you'll be able to see that spiral pattern in seed pod form instead of in flower form. So a good thing to look for, you know. The flowers are pretty straightforward. Again, you know, they're perfect. They're regular, as in there's 4 sepals and 4 petals, and they all look very similar, and we can draw that mirror line very easily. However, the flowers don't last that long, and if you don't catch them, you can still get a pretty confident ID, because it doesn't matter what the seed pod looks like, but does the pattern of the seed pods on the stem match the pattern of flowers that you would expect to see? Plants in this family that you would be familiar with, of course, mustards, hence the namesake, but also things like radishes and horseradish and watercress. Turnips is another one. But the most famous species in this family, in the Brassicaceae family, is a species, the Latin name is Oleracea, or Oleracea, Oleracea. This is an individual species that has been bred by humans to form a number of different vegetables. And basically, by selectively breeding for different parts of the plant and different unique traits that individuals manifested, we've been able to create plants that look drastically different and even taste different, but are technically all the same species. I think I have a good visual for that. Where did that go? Yeah, here we go. Pull this up. Okay, so if you can see this, you can see that we have these 6 very popular, very famous vegetables that most people around the world are going to be familiar with. Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi. All these different names, all these very unique forms, but technically it's all the same species. It's just through breeding, we have selected for different parts of the plant to grow in different ways. So are we selecting for very large buds that are going to form, like the Brussels sprouts and cabbage? Are we selecting for very large leaves that get bigger and bigger, like in the case of kale, and etc.? We can get a huge amount of diversity this way. And so, again, this is going to be the most famous plant in the Brassicaceae family. I could name all of these different veggies separately, but technically it's all the same thing. So we'll recognize it that way. I will point out in this nice visual that I found, it's a great visual source for anybody that wants to understand this idea. But if we want to be technical here, when we're doing this scientific naming, this binomial nomenclature, where we have the genus Brassica and we have the species Oleracea, technically you never capitalize the species name. So this would be capital B Brassica, lowercase o Oleracea. Clearly they spelled it correctly, and I thankfully they used the Latin name so that there would be no confusion. I understand what they're talking about. But if I really want to be picky, I would say that O should not be capitalized. And that's what helps us distinguish a species name from the name of a genus or a family or something else. So The binomial name, the two name, would be genus species, Brassica oleracea. If I wanted to add on the family name, since we're talking about the family of Brassicaceae, then the scientific name of this one species would be Brassicaceae, Brassica oleracea, or oleracea. So, the fun of naming.
We have a couple of questions.
Shoot.
Do mustard seed pods always grow upward? That's what I've always seen.
A lot of them do. And that doesn't have so much to do with the actual seed pod as it does the stem that it's growing off of. You'll find that the flower stems that are growing off of the stalk of most mustard plants, so you'll have your stalk coming up, and you'll have all of these different stems that each produce their own flower that will then each produce their own seed pod. And we're calling it seed pod because, you know, it's not really juicy or palatable or large enough that we want to eat it like a fruit, but it is technically the fruit of the plant. So each of these stems will have its own flower. Each of those flowers will turn into its own fruit. However, I mean, I kind of drew it here that I agree that I find on a lot of mustard plants, on a lot of Brassicaceae plants, that these stems tend to have a bit of an upward angle to them, as opposed to, you know, they're not drooping down in this way. And the seed pods are usually not long enough that like they're going to really hang down in any way. No, they usually have this upward angle to them. And again, so because of that, it doesn't really matter what the shape or size of the seed pod is. It's kind of going to look like it's sticking out and up, and it's because of the stem that it's coming off of.
Are mint flowers regular?
Yes, I believe they are. Yes, mint flowers are regular.
Are there any poison?
No, I'm sorry. Mint is irregular. Because they have a similar form to pea flowers, where they have again they've got the 5 petals, but the way that, like I said, the petals fuse together as the mint flower forms, and it causes, as the petals fuse together at their bases, it causes some of the petals to turn in different directions, so that you'll have some of the petals facing up and some of the petals facing down. Let's pull up a picture. That'll always help. Okay. Okay, here we go. I, of course, do not own this image. I just pulled it up right now real quickly through Google. But so we can see here, we can distinguish petals. This is definitely its own petal. This is definitely its own petal. This is definitely its own petal. It's hard to see in this image, but there's actually 1 and 2 up here, comprising 5 total petals. But we can see when we go back, it looks like they're all one. They're just like different lobes of the same structure. However, when they were first forming, they were all separate. And as they grow larger and larger, they have fused together here and here and here and here, so that it all looks like one thing. Now I could draw a line straight down here, and I would get that mirror image that I'm looking for, if we're thinking that it is a regular flower. However, in order to be classified as regular, I need to be able to draw multiple lines to get that mirrored effect. So I can draw the one here, and I get the mirror effect. However, if I draw a second line here, across it, I don't get the mirror image top to bottom. If I draw another line at a diagonal here, I don't get that mirror image. And for that reason, mint flowers would not be regular. They would be irregular.
Are there any poisonous mustard plants?
Not that I know off the top of my head. There very well could be. There are plenty of examples of plants that are edible because they produce very specific chemicals that we value for their taste or their medicine or something like that, that become poisonous or toxic in larger amounts. So, you know, there are some species where, like, hey, it might have the same chemical in, you know, in black mustard, which is the most common species of mustard, I believe, that is used in making the condiment mustard. But there could be another mustard plant that just has such high concentrations of the same types of chemicals that it becomes very unpalatable, or even potentially could sicken you in some way. But that's just me spitballing off the top of my head. I don't know of any specific species that are poisonous.
Okay. How many more families do we have to go through?
As many as we want to fill the time with. I had 8 total. We can stop whenever, and, you know, I can type up the key distinguishing features I had for each one, and we can send that out with the other material for sure.
I think we should do that because we've already gone over time. But
the main thing that I was trying to get across is that particular method of ID, because I find it really effective of learning these very distinguishing features, you know, for all of the variety and all of these thousands of species of plants that we can find in the world. When we start to narrow it down to the level of families and genuses, there are very simple rules that we can follow, that all plants follow in one way or another, especially all flowering plants. You know, like any plant that has a leaf, those leaves are going to be alternate or opposite. They are going to be simple or compound. If it has a flower, it will have sepals, it will have petals, it will have stamens, etc. Or if it doesn't, that is a very distinguishing feature that we can recognize. And so by appreciating these basics of plant anatomy, we can really expedite the process of ID out in the field. So that's the idea behind learning all those clues.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor, and thank you everyone for coming and listening. I hope that you found all of this helpful. I hope we all have a good night.
Good luck with your plant ID.